First, thanks everybody for coming, of course. I also wanted to say, make sure that you go up and see the exhibition upstairs of Chris's work, because it's coming down tomorrow, I think. And the exhibition is actually funded by a Gateway grant by John and Teresa Rollins, which we're very grateful for. And some other thank yous I want to mention is the art department for sponsoring this event as part of our Alumni Artist Lecture Series. Dave Copestakes was helpful with some of the publicity. Jamar in the art office was also really great help. And Alumni Relations also provided all the refreshments, so thank you for that. One other business thing, because we have a lot of students here. If you're here from the senior seminar class, raise your hand if you're from senior sem. Great, awesome. I just want to make a quick announcement that Chris is going to give his lecture, and we'll leave some time for questions at the end. And then before we sort of enjoy all of the refreshments, I want you to seek out whoever's section you're in, seek out that professor. Karen's sitting up here, Betsy's over here, and then I'll be probably in the front row also. So make sure you come directly to see us so that we can give you either an assignment or some kind of syllabus or any kind of paperwork that you need to know something, whatever it is, for next week, okay? All right, well, so we'll figure that out. Just come find some of us. Well, maybe we'll all stand together and then we can talk to you all at once. And then we can figure that out later. That's interesting that you don't know which section you're in, but it's okay. We'll figure it out. Are there any other questions? Okay. So like I mentioned, Chris will speak and then we'll save questions for the end. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about him in case you haven't read the posters that are around. Chris is an artist who makes paintings, drawings, and artist books. His work has been exhibited nationally at the Urban Institute for Contemporary Arts in Michigan, the Baltimore Museum of Art, and Chicago's ARC Gallery. He's also exhibited his work internationally in London and Finland. He received his MA and MFA at the University of Iowa and his BFA from Arcadia University in 1994. While he was a student here, he also studied at Glasgow School of Art in Scotland. Currently, Chris is the Studio Foundations Coordinator in the Art Department at the University of North Carolina in Greensboro. Please join me in welcoming Chris Thomas.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for the warm welcome. It's been a real treat to be back here on campus at Arcadia and seeing such familiar faces after a long hiatus. The last I've been here was in 2000. This sounds loud enough, right? Yeah. Okay, from where? Okay. And what I wanted to do, it's a great honor to be invited here as an alumni to talk about a recent show of drawings. But it's hard for me not to obviously sort of reflect on the time and think about what I might convey in terms of that trajectory from being someone in your shoes to now. And although I don't want to, and I don't go back quite that long in my slides, what I thought I would try to do is very kind of briefly talk about what I think is actually quite a strong connection, albeit not on the surface appearance of things, to the concerns that I had instilled in me very early on here as a student, which I guarantee you are still in place and sort of guiding me in the studio today. The sheet of drawings that you're looking at, this is from around 2000 and somewhere around there, and this is literally just a shot of the tabletop with some drawings and some studies for paintings going on that in 2000 I was involved with. The last visit I made here was to show a painting from this series of sort of print bar inspired paintings. And at the time I was doing these very faithful reproductions of these kinds of found abstractions, these non-objective abstractions that at that time really made me think about painters like Ellsworth Kelly and minimalism and things like this, and yet I loved the fact that they were coming from cereal boxes. And as a painter, I was able to work from observation, although I was scaling these paintings up to monumental size. These little box tops were becoming 8-foot oil paintings, for example. But the reason I wanted to lead off with this is to touch on how I got my start here as a painter, and again, this is not undergraduate work, but I think, again, representative of things that were certainly important to me as a student here. At the time, and there are people in the room, Betsy Batchelor was my painting instructor, and Bonnie Hayes in art history, and Richard Torchia in the gallery, all these. Dennis Coronin at the time was teaching life drawing, and Bob Morrow, of course, was involved with the design and printmaking. And so I had all these really crucial examples of being an artist and people working in a number of different ways. And the thing that, in hindsight, especially now, the thing that struck me most was that this education seemed to be so much about a kind of, I don't know how quite to say it, learning, well, I'll say it this way. First of all, I felt very connected to Philadelphia in the sense of a sort of tradition of painting and observation-based painting and representational painting. And I think in my studies as an art student here, the idea of formal concerns were definitely in place, really learning the sort of basics of compositional issues and material exploration and all that stuff. But at the same time, it was formal. It was quite expressively oriented. And those two sort of descriptions of approaching painting where there was an attention to the formal concerns, the way things look and the way things are constructed, and then also this sort of expressive capacity was really in my mind. I remember graduating as a senior in the painting program here and spending a lot of time painting as faithfully as I can these translations of the painting studio. I was painting the sinks and I was painting the stairwells in these kind of banal, overlooked spaces, and at the same time I was drawing a lot of satisfaction from that rendering and that transcription. But I'd always do something to mess up the image, I was thinking of it almost like these interiors that were somehow haunted. I'd always layer them in some way that didn't have any corresponding value to what I was actually seeing, but an attempt to kind of layer the image in a way that would be disruptive, or maybe more like this idea of like a psychic slippage, like where it would make you look again at the image and dig a little deeper. And I want to make that connection because that was definitely in place here in my mind as a painter in 1994, and now these paintings I'm going to get into in the last few years, from say 2007 forward, have a lot to do with that kind of revisiting of that old territory, which, again, I was doing paintings like this, completely abstract, non-objective, but at the same time toggling back and forth between making images like these maybe more sort of direct landscape paintings. And I wanted to, again, thinking of the audience today, senior art seminar students and perhaps painting majors and artists in general, I always find it helpful to take the long view as a painter, and I trust now, especially in this kind of trajectory of experimentation where certain bodies of work maybe don't come to a certain kind of fruition like others do, but it's all sort of in service to this broader, overarching conceptual idea. And for me, the two facets of that I want to try to just make clear to you is that, this sort of abiding interest in image production and getting my start as a painter, looking at pictures, looking at what's in front of me and translating that was certainly a fulfilling and sort of philosophical activity, even as a student. And yet, for me, the struggle was always with subject matter. I never knew what I really wanted to paint. And I wound up looking a lot, at making photographs and just the idea of making images of images, especially when you think back of those print bar paintings. What you're looking at there is the most elemental sort of alphabet, so to speak, that comprises any printed image. So, the Mona Lisa could be reduced to those four colors, just like, the coupons in your New York Times. This kind of elemental dissection of an image, I realized, really became the bigger concern as a painter. And so, in these works, what's beginning to happen is that I'm allowing much more of a sort of filtration to occur between the painted image and my source. So in this case, working with photographs in basic Photoshop and different techniques to allow the image to remain somewhat faithful to the original, but then open up into more sort of painterly concerns or questions. Despite what Abby said, I do want to invite you to, if you have any questions, you can feel free to shout them out and comment as you see fit. What I wanted to do is describe, though, this year-long project roughly around this time that was called Omniscience. And this is sort of a fragmented sort of source image that I was working from. This, I'm sure there's an attributable photographer, but this National Geographic photograph pulled fairly at random of trees in the snow with wolves hunting moose. And it was kind of an intuitive choice as a painter that I ripped that and I kept that, and I was looking at it as this, I mean, it reminded me instantly of a Franz Kline painting, this sort of black and white dynamic composition. And again, you're only seeing obviously these fragments of it. But I proceeded to use that source image exclusively for about a year, where my thought was, through various ways of painting and drawing at different scales, using different materials, to perpetually impose painting ideas onto this singular image. And so, as I mentioned a minute ago, you know, I'm involved with a questioning of representational painting. I'm you know, additionally a sort of printmaker, you know, in my background as well. So I'm thinking of ways images are built, ways images can be layered upon one another, transferred from one place to another, and not just the technical ramifications of that, but the fact that an image, I think, changes meaning when you recontextualize it was certainly, you know, part of my thinking at this time. But these paintings really, you know, freed me up. They became sort of like an armature to hang painting ideas. So I could know that the same image was going to be utilized each time, but I could paint it any number of ways. And that's what I did, thinking about this as a project to, for me, technically just kind of push things a little bit, or to try ideas in terms of how far an image might stay connected to a source but resemble it, not in the least, you know, where sometimes these versions got either obliterated, but yet that sort of aura, that remnant of the source, especially over the series, you know, very firmly in play. So I was really curious about that, the way that you know, an image can be made to look more like a sort of traditionally faithful reproduction of a source image, as a painter might tend to use, or where that image gets so obliterated, yet it's still there, almost like a ghost. Just curious about that kind of, that longevity that an image might hold for me. So all these pictures, these primarily that you're looking at, these were roughly 27 inches wide, 37 or 40 inches tall or so. These are oil paintings. There's some transfers going on in this one. And so they diversified. I mean, you know, this is about a year's time, and I'm showing you a fraction of these. And, you know, at the same time, and one other thing I'll mention to all the students in the room, you know, maybe it's not the best thing to admit, but I'm also not showing you what I think are maybe my best paintings exclusively. I wanted to try my best to sort of show a linkage among a body of work from these last couple of years, and to talk a little bit about my process. So hopefully, you know, you might have questions about this. I'd be happy to talk more with you. But using this sort of printmaking mentality really, you know, boils down in my mind to creating a kind of image bank. You know, you sort of develop these matrix images that you can reuse and alter and recycle. And in a sense, I mean, we all do that now. I mean, it's nothing new, but I do think that there's a kind of affinity that we all feel toward certain images, or at least the kind of presence a certain image might hold. And I think we're also not unaccustomed to this idea of projecting images or transferring. And so these approaches really flavor these paintings. And in this painting, this is a really large oil painting, probably about 5 by 6 feet. Again, happening concurrently with that ongoing Omniscience series, which was very much driven by this sort of project parameters. And this was more of a kind of one-off painting. You know, I'm obviously still working from landscape. This is a photograph that I had made at that time. The big technological breakthrough at this time was that I got to use a projector for the first time. And so as a painter slash printmaker, you know, having quick access to a template kind of image being able to be on the wall immediately and at a large scale really was exciting to me. I mean, I sort of could go through that image bank now and make paintings in response on a slightly more ambitious scale than I was able to previously. But the thing about this painting, and I want to just mention this as we go into the next body of work, which you'll probably agree looks really different. You know, there is at this point not only a sort of conceptual concern as a painter of thinking about how to represent an image. So, in fact, a photographic image might end up in a painting world like this. But, you know, as a living, breathing human, you know, at this time too, I'm heavily involved with gardening. You know, I'm realizing that as, you know, a person with other interests outside painting, there might be a way to somehow reconcile what might seem to be sort of competing interests. And so this notion of nature and even physical work, speaking with somebody earlier about a place in Pennsylvania where I got my start as a landscaper. I mean, I've been a tree trimmer for a long time, and now I'm saying that as I'm looking at these paintings. You know, I've always, you know, sort of curious about how that bridge might be built between what goes on in the studio with a much more sort of holistic kind of life attitude. And you'll see what I mean in a second, I think. So this image, I'll just say, is maybe not my favorite because it really does reside much more in that sort of making a picture of a picture mentality. This is sort of almost a preordained picture. I have the photograph, I'm sort of being painterly with it. Not so satisfying anymore to me. And so a shift occurs in the work where I really wanted to try my best to move even further from my notion of how an image might get made or what that image might look like. And so trying to rely less on, because remember I used that one picture for over a year. I was a little tired of looking and responding. I wanted to kind of find a way to, in a sense, work more directly still. And so, you know, in this work, and this is probably around 2009 or so, I made the decision I wanted to try to make pictures that were, A, more process-oriented, which I've always sort of been involved with, but I also wanted to make images that were not photographic-based. I was in love at the time with artists like Martin Kippenberger, and so making paintings in wildly, drastically different ways. Paintings that might be the residue of a kind of performance, were things that were on my mind, you know, lessons of John Cage, for example, letting sort of chance into the studio in a more willing and profound way, perhaps. And so while the notions of landscape are in place, I think, this looks like a plant form, you know, a painting like this comes about through a much more process-oriented way. In this case, sort of counting tricks that I would use to figure out how many lines might get laid down in a certain expanse of canvas. And while you might not be able to see all of this as I say it, I am telling you that in the background of these paintings, I'm trying to trip myself up. I'm trying to make paintings that are less formally, I don't know if cogent's the right word, challenging maybe, more formally challenging to me, and also literally physically challenging to make. So well, I'll show you what I mean in a second, but paintings like this were developing where you know, compositions were arrived at more loosely. Again, the layering process is in more full effect. This question of how to incorporate a kind of physical presence in the work, especially after I've just been, weeding the garden and, planting shrubs, this kind of, feeling is in me of wanting to have paintings kind of match that kind of energy output or have that kind of resistance to me. And so in these paintings, which are large, this is probably about 6 by 7.5 feet or so, oil paint, this is oil paint with a caulk gun, right? Like directly applied, so the lines are very dimensional, things are very built up and collaged in, so the canvas is really built up and so on. So there are these different tactics at work to try to complicate the process for myself, but also hopefully to take me into a realm of image making that was new to me, that felt conceptually honest, and also linked to what has come previously. But you see what I'm saying, on the surface, those paintings look like they're done perhaps by 2 different artists. But there is still this kind of, I think, this approach from a slightly different angle that still deals with sort of physical nature and also the presence of an image in the end. So again, more of these kinds of paintings. These kinds of polyrhythmic paintings that I think also, I think maybe what I should mention here too is that, things are obviously taking a turn toward the abstract. And as I thought about this question of how to translate truly that kind of physical experience of not only making but also the creation of that image, I think it can be, go way beyond just transcribing a photograph. A picture of the forest only gives you a very thin slice, I think, of that place and time and that experience of recollecting or recreating. And so I think these paintings, through abstraction, really get at more of a kind of embrace of the broader senses. I think paintings like this feel auditory in a way that I'm intrigued by. And I think they sort of have a more open-ended, ambiguous reading. I'll mention something about this drawing to sort of try again to make the link to sort of this previous line of work that deals with nature. In this case, again, that sort of process-oriented approach is in place, obviously. The sort of counting arrangement and so on is just a framework to think about color and mark and such. But in this case, I had a bumper crop of black walnuts in the garden against my will. And if any of you have ever made paper, you keep a big rubber garbage can out in your yard to collect black walnuts to make dye for your paper. So all of this brown ink is made from walnuts in the yard. So again, asking a question of myself in the studio, like if I really am making paintings about, at least at this time, somehow this gardening interest that I have, I want to find this kind of connection. Well, it struck me literally that obviously materials can play a bigger role in that kind of conversation. And this is an example of that. An acrylic picture that is abused, drawn in with drill bits, anything that I could do to impress upon the physical and leave a kind of residue of tools and manipulation of materials is something that was very much in play at this time. So certain drawings too, like I said, were challenging to make, so I don't know if this is exactly one of these, but I would do things like I've always loved those videos of Matthew Barney when he's all strung up and trying to make a mark on the ceiling, like this kind of physical endurance kind of test to make a puny little mark. I was doing things in a similar fashion where I'd make it really hard to reach, or I'd be, you'll think I'm so strange, but I'm up in front of a whole room of people, standing on one foot, and trying to make a mark that's 10 feet out with this. It sounds silly, and you might not know that that's actually in play, but again, that sort of studio dynamic of doing everything that I could to kind of let the paintings sort of evolve on their own without too much intentionality on my part. I was coaxing and I was reaching for the stuff. You know, where compositions form more fluidly, there's a lot of that sort of chance occurrence that I'm allowing at this point and responding to in a way that is, again, you might think as a student, right, how do you kind of perpetuate your engagement? Well, for me, this was one of those moments where I was certainly making paintings that I didn't know what to make of at the time. I didn't know if I liked them. Thought, you know, these are pretty awful and ugly paintings, mind you. But I felt that it was crucial to kind of allow that to percolate at that time. You know, I have a different conception of, or perception of them now that I look back. But, you know, challenging my notion of taste is what I was spending some time doing in these paintings. Another kind of structural painting. This is an oil painting, about 40 by 50 inches. Kind of genealogy structures, I guess, sort of linkages. Small paintings that became almost like games where I would coat old paintings with thick oil paint and then plow my way through it. Sort of systematically, a lot of times these works. There's a great show a couple years ago at the Drawing Center, the Tantric drawings from India, that, you know, this idea of drawing being a meditative practice. It's very intriguing to me in the way, too, that an image might be arrived upon through a kind of luck or a kind of passivity. It sounds counterintuitive to what I'm describing, this sort of physical investment, but those two things seemingly at odds were kind of on my mind at the same time. So these paintings taking many different forms at this point. You know, these are leaf-like forms, they're camouflage-like. Primarily I'm thinking about layering and trying my best with a lot of different materials, like working on artist books. These are big paper collages that would, you know, scraps would accumulate in the studio, and I would try my best, like a good gardener might, to never throw anything away, but to recycle and compost old paintings and such. And I found that to sort of perpetuate a kind of visual vocabulary. I kept finding myself, you know, kind of pulling from the same catalog, so to speak. And again, another way of generating images in a new way. Funkier, collage-based compositions like this one. Other drawings that were structural, but you know, done blindfolded and with two hands, you know, trying to make drawings that were about a sensitivity just to touch and trying to think about what that might be. I was obsessed with, you see pictures of those guys who can write on chalkboards with two hands. Like, I can't do that, but I can pretend to do that. And, you know, again, trying to make a painting that would be done in this way that was totally foreign and clunky, demandingly physical. That period of time, you know, up until around this painting in 2010, you kind of see now the two sides of this coin that I'm kind of working from, this kind of representational mindset, you know, very much involved with and believing in, you know, the power of an image, that an image can be, especially through painting, given a kind of spirit and given multifold of meanings, right? It can be multiplied by that translation. But then at the same time, as a guy who loves abstraction, you know, really wanting that itch scratched, so to speak, and like thinking about this sort of the generation of new forms that I might respond to personally and physically and very materially, you know, I'm trying to kind of reconcile these two things. And so right around 2010, I was spending some time in North Georgia in the woods. If you've seen the movie Deliverance, I was in that area. I was in Clayton, Georgia. That banjo player is still in town, by the way. If you go there, you can meet him, the boy. And you know, it was at that time I had these couple of weeks to make new work, and I went knowingly sort of empty-handed, apart from my then battered digital projector, which I still have, and some images that I had made with a camera. And you know, this is me, very caveman Photoshop style. My interest is not so much to make amazing sort of digital magic happen as much as I'm using that software to simply break down the image to an even lower resolution, the idea of image construction either in colored halftone approaches like this one, or bitmapped images, things like that, I find to be a very interesting way, and as a painter, a satisfying way to approach objectively an image's construction. And so around this time, I'm taking a little break from the sort of mushy paint, smelly mess making that I've been doing, and seeking a little bit more of a kind of refinement in the work. And so first of all, flattening the surfaces, in this case using watercolor on paper to make a more cohesive image that is still sort of pixelated or broken up, broken down. And at the same time, this painting on paper, this is a watercolor painting, happened where I guess I would maybe point to this one as sort of a breakthrough painting. I think it's one that certainly ties in most closely with the work upstairs. And this is, within a week's time where I looked at this and said, no thank you, and moved into this way of working, which instantly held more flexibility to me. The format was not quite as obvious, I think, although maybe even more repetitive. I don't want to say repetitious, that sounds boring, and I don't think these are necessarily boring pictures, although they do rely on order and actually to a high degree disorder. So, a long-standing interest in mine, especially going back to those little print bars I showed you earlier, the way things are printed off register, those glitches, those print registrations that are left bare, that sort of seeing behind the curtain, so to speak, right? I always love that aesthetically, I love that conceptually, and so, a painting like this feels like a more full embrace of laying bare very much the sort of process that goes into constructing a picture, but not having that feel so cold. Do you know what I mean? Especially like working from a projection, and any of you who do digital stuff or even printmaking, right? I think when you copy something, you're either, calling it in, or you're on the phone and you're copying those lines without a lot of mindfulness, or I think you can actually use that to sort of step off and allow for a sort of flexibility to encroach. And in this case, there's a lot of variation, down to the way these marks are built up, very systematically, mind you. But I think I am sort of interested in this kind of organic blend here, that there's a kind of, what paintings I've been loving? Those Charles Birchfield paintings, these sort of landscapes that buzz with sound and temperature. I was thinking a lot about that, the way he has this way of painting what cicadas sound like. There's a kind of illustrative way that he does that at times, but I love that notion of pictures kind of vibrating or having this kind of auditory sensation. And, this was done, sort of, again, with that sort of, hopefully that sort of responsiveness to nature in play. And at the same time, an image that feels much more graphically directed. This one is, pure pattern. I couldn't tell you what that lower image came from. It's photographic, I guess. Going in this direction of just allowing now, hopefully, this process to shake itself out, and trusting that through collage, which I always am doing, I'm not showing you a lot of that stuff, but tinkering with how images can get piled up or layered. In this case, trying to approach a work like this for the first time on a really large scale. So, this is a drawing that measures almost 60 inches high by 50 or so wide. So it's a big ink drawing. It's done with brush and ink. It's, there's a detail of it. So it's all painted directly. There's no collage on this. But, just to give you a sense now of how my attentions are turning, I'm realizing that, while I was truly making a mess in the studio, doing all that I could to pour new concoctions and paint with brooms and do all this kind of thing, in the end, I wanted images that were, in a sense, physically demanding, but more so, visually rich and visually present and stimulating. And for various reasons, taking as my tact here this kind of buildup of mark. So the slowness now as a kind of counterpoint to all the sort of speedy mess-making I was doing with all my walnut dyes, for example. But thinking of how to let these images be articulated on a bigger scale over a greater amount of time was sort of the lesson that this body of work is bringing up now. You can tell, back on that green field painting and even these last two, this notion of a field, right? The field of pattern, a field of activity, sort of using that sort of grid arrangement as a sort of armature to mess with and hang things that seem at first to be trustworthy pattern that fall short, that have errors or have glitches that make you look again. But also primarily at this time, that idea of a field, thinking back of, on all the paintings that I love, this sort of non-objective, color field, and the way, too, painting activates that surface from top to bottom and left to right, still very much, front and center in my mind as I approach all of these paintings. In this acrylic painting, there's, it's kind of again, a sort of process-oriented one. This one, I can tell you, is very much made with sort of printing in mind. It's all made with rollers and chunks. Each morning, I remember vividly, I'd go out before the sun rose and take my coffee out, and I would be able to paint, 3 or 4 of those quick patches of blue. And, these paintings get more into that kind of daily rhythm, and I think because of that, they also, they change the way I'm working on them. This one, done with rollers and a brush to lay on that line. This painting is another acrylic painting, but in this case, this design is superimposed over, in this case now, obviously they're similar. So the format again is in place, and it's freeing me up as a painter to not so much think about composition, but think about other concerns. In this case, the color was important to me. This is actually, if you've ever been to North Carolina, that underline, that sort of sienna color, is as perfect a match to the soil outside my studio as I could mix and match. So again, this is a non-objective kind of abstraction, but there's an element in this painting and in my mind that's crucially linked to, still back to this representational aspect, that in fact this color is very studied and very particular to a place and time, is part of this work, even though it is a kind of pattern-based abstraction. You might not know that otherwise. This is an acrylic painting. These all are about 30 inches by 40 inches. Some are more graphic than others. This one maybe, goes back to tinkering with that idea of a physical kind of obviousness. This one is literally cleaning out the studio, and these are scraps of canvas, end rolls and things like this that are stitched together and hinged together with PVA, and then all my friends used to joke that I was a prainter because I paint like a printer, and so this idea of stenciling or imposing a kind of repetitive motif like a printmaker would, but doing it with acrylic, superimposed on this deliberately kind of makeshift support. Again, sort of feeling out that boundary between something graphic and clean and something that is very tactile and very physically and sensually kind of rich. This is a mixed media collage that maybe illustrates that a little bit better. So you're looking at a few sheets layered up, different kinds of papers, ink being applied with different methods, being printed on, being brushed on, being dripped. The overlay is a sheet that's been etched. It's got mica ground into the inks, and so it has actually kind of an iridescent sheen, and yet it has these hard-edged squares cut out of it. So all this kind of back and forth between things being crisp or things being atmospheric, materially complicated was something that I definitely wanted to maintain in this body of work. And these are some details of that piece. I think that kind of alludes, I mean, it's only been, it's been a few years actually since I've been making these kinds of pictures and using a projector to do this, which, I find it indispensable. I don't think of it as a crutch in any way. I think it's a way of responding to an image that I find really useful. But obviously, I was very concerned, I didn't want it to be kind of a rote activity, and I would be really nervous if the painting's always read as kind of boring, sort of cool copies. And so in this work and the work upstairs, hopefully that that translation works, that it's not just about that sort of mimicry, but there's room for that kind of softening to occur, kind of a more subjective conversation to emerge through the course of working. A little drawing like this, now I have some images from my sketchbook and things like this to kind of give you a sense of maybe some of the asides or things that lead up to the bigger, more time-consuming works. But this is just a little pen and ink drawing, and I'm using little templates, and I have tracing paper, and I tend to record little patterns if I find them, and I keep kind of like a sketchbook of these kinds of matrices to work from. But these are doodles. They're just kind of little color studies and pen and ink studies in this case, which I did a lot of this summer. And they show you what I mean, trying to loosen things up. The big projections can feel a little more refined at times. But this idea of abrupt layering, like the compost piles are rotting heaps in the yard, this kind of randomness and chaos is something that always has been in the work that I make. And so even taking these like funny little drawing kits with the little circles and shapes and just messing with them in the sketchbook to pile them up and disrupt an otherwise regular pattern, elongating things. So just, again, in the sketchbook, just kind of thinking of how to distort things, how to distend or alter, and also thinking of drawing directly and applying color in this way is something that came out of this series of drawings at this time. And if you've seen the drawings upstairs, you kind of know that these are kind of a relief after like the kind of methodical application, which is not painful so much, but there is a kind of focused space that those paintings require, and these sketchbook works are quickly made and feeding that, but they take on a different kind of life, I think. And we move into the work that's upstairs. This is a detail of one of the pieces upstairs to show you that link. These are all the works being done with pen and ink on a small scale, and I just literally thought it would be kind of perverse to take that intimate process and try to make them really big. And so using this kind of decidedly small tool to cover a large expanse of cotton paper, is a deliberate choice. I was curious about how this kind of intensity might play out. And so as we move into this body of work, again, now in full sort of working mode, all of these pictures are made from photographs. In this case, this is a photograph of a previous painting, so kind of recycling another full-color painting into this more reduced language of just black ink on white paper. Again, that print mentality, taking an image through another sort of evolution, is something that always happens. This painting, I think, I guess would be maybe that next sort of breakthrough painting in this series, this painting that's called Giorno, sort of that daily working, in the Renaissance with frescoes, what could get done in a day, right? You can spot, right, the way that plaster dries, and that's a section that records a certain amount of time, not just image. And so this painting was taken on with that sort of mindset where I knew going into it that it was obviously big enough that it wasn't going to get done in one sitting. And this one in particular is based on photographs of collage scraps in the studio. I keep big Tupperware bins of papers and things like this that either get used for collage or drawing and so on. So again, this was a photograph of just pure chaos, snips and ends of failed drawings and paintings and projects, right? And again, with these, I'm not being, I don't think, too artful in the photograph. A lot of times the composition is more intuitively arrived at. I'll take maybe a handful of photographs pretty casually and then typically just pick one that sits right. There's a kind of bodily presence that I maybe anticipate, especially when projected on the wall, smaller than this, but still, larger than you, right? I mean, sort of human size. There's a way that kind of bodily presence often to me signifies that one composition over another will be selected. And in this case, the sort of play out of this, which was new at the time, was really to sort of chip away at an image patiently, knowing that it wasn't going anywhere, to allow the color to migrate over the course of the work and try not to think too much about it, but to allow that process and that sort of gestation period to really become a factor in the paintings in a way that it wasn't previously. So a photograph of compost in the yard might look like that, just so you kind of know where I'm working from. Nothing fancy, right? It's just looking down, the ground, the field. Photographs like this of other stuff in the yard, to be honest, not as satisfying to me as some of the more recent paintings. This still has pretty clear vestiges of, I think, the photographic, or at least it's a more graphic solution, which more and more I'm drawn to the images in this vein that remain more ambiguous. And I think, and this is where I'm going anyway, thinking about photography related to painting, I do think that that's, I think it's fascinating territory, obviously, but how you tread that line between the resolution, how much is revealed, or how honest you can be with replicating the photograph, and yet how alien the image still might become. For example, this last one, which really doesn't project too well, but it's upstairs. That's the painting at the time that was the most fully wrought. Every single pixel that I could see from the original photograph I recorded, but I recorded it obviously in tones of ink and colors that are barely perceptible. They're just off the white of the paper. So again, that word perverse comes to mind, but I'm so intrigued by the way that in this case I am being as honest and complete as I can, and yet this image maybe seems of all of them the most incomplete, and yet it demands that, I think, up close recognition that there's a lot going on longer. I think these images too, while I'm talking about compost and gardening, I think, for me, that's where they get their start. And my studio literally opens up into the cow fields of Climax, North Carolina, where I'm from. And, so I feel like I'm in the sort of garden as I'm painting. Not that it just happened that way. So there is that connection. But I do hesitate to, limit these paintings to just that. I think they do get their start. I think more so, to me, the sort of conceptual link to what that process is about is what is perpetuating these paintings for me more and more presently, which is like compost. It's the idea of things breaking down and being regenerated, that energy can come from that kind of dismantling of form. It changes literally. And And so that, to me, sounds really profound. And I love that notion as a painter, right? I mean, it's perfectly metaphorical, but I love that as a painter that I can sort of trust now that I can just keep piling stuff on the pile, you know, and if I turn it over once in a while, that there's always going to be like something kind of emerging. And so I feel a sense of that kind of comfort, or at least understanding of how a body of work like this now might sort of perpetuate itself. And I definitely feel strongly about that related to this current work that I've been lucky enough to show here. So these are just some pictures from the studio just to kind of give you a sense of how things are maybe looking. This is very near the end of the talk. You're free to pipe up and say things or question me if you want to. But I'll just give you a sense of maybe what these look like in the space and give a different sense of scale. It's a little bit hokey, but I mean, these are some things that, you know, this is from the summer, these couple of photographs of just, you know, as I look through the sort of photo bank, I mean, these are some images that I took around the studio that resonate with me, or, you know, in a case like this, you know, and I don't work specifically from a photograph like this per se, but this is sort of what I'm reflecting on. And, you know, in a case like this, not only thinking about saturation of color, but saturation of information, complexity of forms, you know, density of layering. I mean, that's definitely textures, you know, various shapes. You know, this kind of stuff is obviously, as a painter, my bread and butter. And so thinking of these things and observing these things, if not just photographing them, you know, I'm such a geek, you know, I get to bring all my paintings and hang them in your beautiful gallery, and then I get to paint the walls in my studio, which is really nice. And, you know, even then, to have this Vermeer moment of, you know, a nice clean wall, and then go, well, there are 3 different white paints there, and you can see how tall and how lazy I was to either get the ladder or leave it. And, you know, I love, I mean, even just that, you know, this sense of, I mean, it's really nice to paint your studio walls, right? It's like the new horizon, the promise. But also then, you know, obviously related to my current concerns, just this affinity toward, in this case, you know, subtlety, white on white, totally caught my eye. You know, that's, if I'm looking through the projector, I'm seeing things in that sort of grid format. That's a, anybody know that moth? I looked it up, I can't remember, it's a white leopard. Anyway, you know, it relates. Fixing the cinder blocks, you know, the mortar, the sort of way an edge is made, the way an edge changes, moving from wet to dry, for example. You know, these last couple of pictures are the ones, and I really apologize, these last couple of paintings, I wasn't able to get photographed properly, so I have some of my bad reproductions here, but these would be the newest pictures, and this is a detail of one. Maybe at this point it's evident that there's even greater complexity in these, and you can compare these for sure to the pictures upstairs. I mean, these are very much in that trajectory, but in these more recent paintings, trying to even go further with how many layers can occur for a lot of different reasons, to push the mark making and how things get drawn or applied, whether it's sharp edged with a pen or blotted on with a kind of cotton ball. You know, all these different sort of applications can still now, even more now, have room to play in these compositions, because and I think, you know, if you see these upstairs, that there is now a way that I think almost each painting compositionally almost bleeds right into the next, that there is a sense, I feel, especially in the studio, of being in one big image world. Does that make sense? I mean, these are not radically different one composition to the next. So anyway, these are some details of recent ones. These are the latest 2 drawings. They've gotten a little bit bigger, sort of. The color is getting more complex. They don't really look so good up there, though. Yeah, I thought I would do this. I'm doing a book project at the moment, and this is one of the pages in the book, and I thought I would include this because I wanted to show you in closing just a couple of images from a sketchbook that's happening in conjunction with these paintings, again, for students who are at work. You know, this idea of feeding that practice and giving yourself sort of stuff to chew on or jump off from. This is from an artist book I'm working on right now with some collaborators. And the last bit, I think, is really appropriate for me lately, this idea of every step into presence, everything is a sign. It sounds spiritual, it sounds forming. And the way it relates to this current batch of work is that as those drawings are being made, and I'll tend to basically work on one or two at a time, they're up on the walls, and I tend to work in a slightly darkened studio, or not so dark, but dark enough that I'm projecting these images onto the wall, and for me to see the colors that I'm making with my ink, and I basically have a table with, a bunch of different yogurt containers that I'm mixing and letting inks kind of develop and mixing and matching. I tend to kind of keep this running sort of index of colors so I can see what I'm about to use. So I basically just have scrap papers that accumulate these more or less organized. This is my palette, basically. And so this idea, that there is a kind of process involved, and again, it's a little bit like catching the rain from your gutters, trying to sort of save what you do, and it does relate to this work more and more, I think, and it's also just of interest to me to kind of snag those fragments, or letting the process, again, kind of leave this secondary kind of work, or this kind of residue of the main event. It's something that these books and collages are sort of beginning to form here. This is a book that's all bound, but kind of a record of recent interests, and just kind of looking at textural ideas, color ideas, and then keeping a record of these kinds of, from week to week. These are like color journals, basically, or what are forming, and I've got mounds and mounds of these things. Also lately, in the studio, you'll see little snippets, more and more kind of, I would never say sculptural, I'm too embarrassed to say sculptural, but more materially diverse little experiments, so screens being sewn into paper, just kind of looking at grid and color, and just thinking about different kinds of tactile qualities, cactuses and grids, and these are some little tinkerings that are on the wall, sort of collage items that are sort of always happening, like little bouquets. Ink studies on paper, just rolled into different forms, and just thinking about, like there's a cup that's held ink for a long time that looks really nice on the inside, that I'm going to try to think of a way to use that technique intentionally. And like up there, you'll see like metal, use metal canisters to hold ink, and just like how when there's a drought and a lake recedes, you get that sort of strata of evaporation. And so I have this kind of laboratory setup at the moment where things are all sort of at different levels of evaporation and being fed different colors to kind of create these sort of tubs of gradients of color, which I couldn't imagine setting out to paint, but I can sort of make in this way. It's the end of the season. I bought a lot of kiddie pools at Dollar General recently, so that I can do sort of big sheets of, sort of like staining and soaking pages to kind of take these ideas, but to bring them more into kind of the realm that you're seeing up with those drawings of a bigger scale, and developing sort of grounds to work on. So you see there, like, these scraps of cotton paper that accumulate, and I tend to soak them in the sink, or and they'll get dipped, or they get buried in the ground outside, or left out in the rain, or who knows what. They'll just get kind of weathered, patinaed. And that was just sort of an aside. The work that I'm showing you upstairs, that's, I think, the main event. But again, as a student, you might think of ways that there are outlets that come from that, and this is an example of that. This is just this summer. I thought, well, I can almost make work now out of this sort of process that I do anyway. So you get a sense of sort of the blotter that I have out next to my palette, that I sort of test my ink swatches, my ink colors. And then this is what maybe some of those sheets start to become. They tend to want to be paintings now. I'm not sure what I'm going to do with these yet. I think I'll maybe just wallpaper a wall. You know, they're getting to be like that, sort of a diptych, which, you know, this is very, again, I don't know if these are good or bad. I don't know if this is a real painting yet, but I'm showing it to you because it is an extension of the work that you're seeing upstairs. And it is one of those questions, I think, that as an artist, you know, you're going to be almost always faced with, right? Like, you know, do you make what you know you can make, or are you going to sort of let that one door stay open where you can, you know, nobody needs to know about it. You know what I mean? You can sort of experiment a little bit and, you know, not be afraid of making. And trust me, I didn't show you a lot of really bad paintings that I really needed to sort of do just to try things out. And I think that is not to be underestimated. You know, I think this is sort of born of that spirit of just tinkering and letting things kind of sit around a while. Kind of get a sense of what that might look like. And I think this is the last image. This is when I left my studio yesterday morning, this was what was on the wall. And I cannot wait to go back and get rid of that big red thing. Maybe, I don't know. Anyway, so that's the last image. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to have a conversation with you.